Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to another scintillating, didactic, and provocative session of business and its environment. Hopefully, you're not snowed in wherever you are. Things are absolutely bright and shiny here in Vermtown today. The palm trees are waving. The students are out on the sandy beaches here with their beach towels. Life is good in Vermtown, and hopefully it is where you are at too. Well, last week we began talking about ethics. Today we're going to get a little deeper into the subject of facing the reality of making ethical decision, ethical decisions in business. Now, on the one hand, it's easy to stand by and be what I call a fearless spectator when you're not the person actually involved in the ethical dilemma. But nevertheless, I think everybody is going to come up against difficult ethical decisions during their business lives. It's just a fact of life. So let's dive into our subject. And I think the beginning chapter, chapter 8, gives us an interesting introduction to the subject matter. So we got, David Geffen, who's a talent agent. And here he is essentially, cheated his way up the successful business, ladder. And the question ultimately is raised under these circumstances and other ones that we'll visit, whether the ends sought justify the means used. Well, of course, we can all agree that decisions do have consequences, for better or for worse. Let me take another approach, looking at the Geffen situation through another lens. So assume for the moment our food pantry in town here is out of food. And we have a certainly needy elderly and children who rely upon the food pantry, but we're out of food. Well, you're a good-hearted Vermillionaire, and so the question crosses your mind, well, both Walmart and Hy-Vee have a lot of food. How about if I were to shoplift food at either or both of those stores for the exclusive purpose of feeding the food pantry? So can the ends sought justify the means used? Well, on the one hand, you would step back and say, well, no, that's an obvious, theft. That's a crime. Yes, we've got starving people that we need to feed, but now stealing food, is not an appropriate course of action in order to stock the food pantry. Well, looking back at David Geffen, well, is his lying and misrepresentation and cheating, does that type of behavior justify his attempting to be successful in his, talent agent business? Well, how about this situation? Because this is the one I actually use in my face-to-face classes to try and get students to start thinking more deeply about ethical decision making. So let's assume for the moment you're a recent B school graduate. And like all other B school graduates, you've got a mountain of debt that you need to be paying on. You also have a sick spouse, and you've got 4 children to feed. So getting a job that now pays you $75,000 a year, that's a lot of money coming out of the business school. And the job is with ABC Corporation, and ABC has hired you to be an assistant controller for that company. So, wow, you are really glad to get this job. It's $75,000 salary, a great health benefit plan. Wow, this is a super job, and you and your family need it. Well, here comes the chief financial officer. He welcomes you to the company, says, look, the reason why we hired you was because you are a team player. And that's what we look for in this company, team players. So you are a team player. So he gives you a high five and you match him with your high five. And he said, look, one of the really important responsibilities you have is that you're going to prepare the quarterly earnings report for our company. It's publicly traded. This is really an important report that investors on Wall Street watch with precision. And so we have reported, like General Electric, 7.5% quarterly returns. And so that's what we're looking at for you to do for us. So I'll be back in 3 months and we'll take a look at the quarterly returns. But remember, 7.5, that's the magic number we're looking at. Well, you do your job loyally and properly and ethically, and then you discover when you're preparing the first quarterly earnings report, guess what? Doesn't add up to 7.5. I mean, it doesn't add up to the 7.5%. It adds up to something, less than that. What to do? You're a team player, right? Now, you know that if you get fired, hey, somebody else is going to take your place who ultimately or eventually is going to, put down 7.5, even though the numbers, let's say, for the sake of illustration, only point to 6.5 in terms of actual quarterly earnings. What to do? What to do? You need this job, don't you? You really need this job. You got a sick wife. She's a diabetic. You got 4 children to feed. You got mountains of debt. You need this job. Do you feel any ethical, tension? And this is how good people end up making, bad decisions. Now, while I've used different numbers with you now, I think the point is made that, hey, look, whatever the company has always reported, whether or not the numbers are real, presents an interesting ethical challenge for the assistant controller. So, hey, look, at the end of the first quarter, your numbers really only justify a 6.5% revenue. But the CFO is expecting 7.5. What to do? Decisions have consequences. You need this job. Well, let's take a look back at other similar cases. Now, Arthur Fastow was the chief financial officer at Enron. And Enron had 10 banks that it had a line of credit with. And so it was critical that their quarterly earnings report looked good, right? And so Enron engaged in what we simply referred to as creative accounting. In the sense, they would sell a energy contract to, let's say, Pacific Gas and Electric in California for, let's say, $200 million. But the $200 million was payable to Enron over 20 years. So it didn't get the $200 million up front. All right. So, 20 years, that's going to be, 20 years at about $5 million a year is what the revenue would ordinarily be reported, right, on that type of transaction. But no. Instead of reporting just $5 million for the first year, Enron reports all $20 million as revenue. So even though it hasn't received the $20 million, it reports as revenue $20 million and not $5 million for just 1 year. Well, does this perhaps mislead investors and these 10 banks that provided a line of credit? And so Enron played fast and fancy-free with the numbers, aided and abetted, of course, by Arthur Andersen, who was their accountant. What about WorldCom? WorldCom was the largest bankruptcy in history. Yet they and Enron, were deemed in 2000 to be, the most highly successful, companies going on Wall Street. But what happened with WorldCom? WorldCom saw lots of bad debt pile up. And so they were looking to sell the company and everybody get out before the company's stock crashed. And so we had again what Walter Pavlo, who was the chief of claims for WorldCom, what he said, they would quarterly get the lawyers and the accountants together in a room, what he called MBAs run wild, and they would cook the books. They would take revenue from one account and attribute it to an unrelated account. Then they would take debt from one account and attribute it to an unrelated account. We simply refer to that as criminal and civil fraud. Materially false statements. But why did all these people at WorldCom engage in this activity? Why did all these folks at Enron engage in this activity? Well, I think it's true. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And then when ethics come into conflict with intense personal needs, you really need this job, don't you? You really need the benefit plan. You really need the salary to pay off college debt. You really, really, really need this. So when you have this conflict between ethics and personal needs, which more often than not wins out? Oh, come on, Professor Huck. This isn't fair. This is not fair. You're not being fair. You're absolutely right. I'm not being fair because many ethics problems are not fair to start with. Yet they require decisions, and we know decisions have consequences. So fundamentally, we have to sit back and say, okay, when we get conflicted, how do we decide right from wrong when no good options are being presented to us? Only the lesser of two or more evils. And that certainly is the situation our recent graduate assistant controller is facing, right? No good options. So clearly, when you're conflicted, it is difficult to make a correct decision. And remember what we said last week. How do we define ethics? Simply correct decision making, right? We've all agreed unethical decision making is wrong decision making. Well, ethical decision making is correct decision making. Easy for me to say. What do we do when we get conflicted, when our personal needs get wrapped up in organizational demands? How do we find our way through this difficult analytical process to arrive at the correct decision? Well, that's where ethical principles can guide us. Like a compass, we're lost in the forest. How do we find our way home? Well, a compass can help us do that. And that's what ethical principles can provide for us. A compass. So we're going to look at a number of ethical principles to illustrate their importance. Now, one school, that's simply referred to as the deontological ethical school, says, look, actions are right or wrong in themselves, independent of the consequences. So going back to my assistant controller situation here, falsely representing quarterly returns, we would agree is wrong to start with, right? Independent of whether or not, I get fired or not. And so the deontological school would say, look, if you know this to be wrong to start with, you don't need to go anywhere else. You know what your duty is. And what is duty? Doing what ought to be done. So, when Geffen, for example, in our textbook illustration lied to get and keep an early job, his actions certainly violated this, standard. And the problem with this is once you start lying in the beginning, subsequent situations make it easier for you to lie and lie again until there's not much left of your character. And that certainly is what happened at Enron and WorldCom. I mean, when I heard Walter Pavlo, the former chief of claims, he had been the deputy chief of claims, and his boss had come to him and said, "Look, Walter, I'm leaving." His boss was actually a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. And his boss instantly, knew when they started putting the arm on him about cooking the books, said, no, I'm not doing that. I'll leave before I will participate in fraud. Well, his boss told Walter, the deputy chief of claims, he said, look, Walter, I'm leaving. You should leave too. They're going to ask you to do things you ought not to do. Unfortunately, when Walter got elevated to his boss's job after he left, Walter just couldn't resist the temptation to play the game of cooking the books. And so ultimately, when the WorldCom scam imploded, Walter got federally convicted and got a chance to go to jail for 2 years. And a condition of his parole is he had to go around and give these speeches to business schools about where he went wrong and why. A second school of ethics is what we call the consequentialism school. That says, look, actions can be right or wrong based on their consequences. So back to my example of the assistant controller engaging in fraudulent reporting. So what are the consequences of fraudulent reporting? Not good, right? Not good. In the short run, maybe you can fool the 10 banks that are providing, lines of credit and whatnot, or you can fool investors on Wall Street, but you can't fool them indefinitely, can you? You recall from your Ethics 101 book that John Maxwell says, look, there are really 3 reasons why people make knowing, willing, voluntary, ethical mistakes. The first is we do what's most convenient. Yeah, take the lower road. Oh, everybody else does it. I just don't want to be a fish swimming upstream. I'm going to do what's most convenient here. Or we do what we have to win. Certainly there was intense pressure at Wells Fargo, those 5,300 sales employees. They were trying to win all these bonuses, win all these prizes, win all these valuable things that were connected to sales. And then, of course, rationalization with relativism. Well, everybody else is doing this, so, it's not that big a deal. Hey, Wall Street cooks the books all the time. Hey, I'm just a pretty small fish here. A third reason why good people make bad decisions. So were those 5,300 people at Wells Fargo evil people? Were they criminals? I mean, think about it, 5,300 people? Or did they choose what was most convenient, what they had to do to win, or rationalized their behavior? I think Pope John Paul had an interesting observation when he said, look, the freedom to choose inherently includes the obligation to choose correctly. Looking at some more models here. Immanuel Kant has an ethical model he calls the ethical imperative that simply says, look, we should act in the same way that our actions would be universal. That is, if everybody else could cook the books, then my behavior would be okay ethically. Well, We all know, now wait a minute, if everybody engaged in fraud, how would we do business? Because business operates on the basis of numbers, right? Numbers in business mean something. It's our commercial language. But what happens if it's false information? Well, we've seen this movie before in 2000, right? The dot-com bubble that brought us Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002. And then we saw it again with the real estate mortgage bubble in 2008 that brought us Dodd-Frank, right? Lots of unethical behavior there. The conventionalist ethic says, look, it's all right to take the proposed course of action if it doesn't violate the law. Wow, wait a minute. Your assistant controller is going to be engaging in civil and criminal fraud by knowingly, willingly, intelligently, falsely reporting numbers that are untrue. That should tell you right then and there, I know I need this job, but I'm sorry, boss, I can't do this. A defense might be simply to ask your boss when he comes wanting that 7.5% return report, to simply ask him straight up, sir, with all due respect, are you asking me to make a criminally fraudulent earnings report? Now, I think anybody that speaks truth to power and asks that question, are you asking me to commit a crime? I don't think the power is going to say, yes, assistant controller, that's exactly what I'm asking you to do. I think that defies imagination. No, I think you're going to see them back off. No, I was merely suggesting it as a goal that we're striving for, but if the numbers don't add up, then I guess the numbers don't add up. And so I think confronting and speaking truth to power is a good way to go. And I would bet you money that more often than not, power will back off, and that can work to your advantage. The disclosure rules, one of my favorites. So how would you feel if you had to explain your proposed ethical decision to misrepresent this financial data to a wide audience, such as television viewers or newspaper readers? Gee whiz, let me explain why I cheated. What would your mother have to say about that? So the disclosure rule is a good question to ask yourself. Aristotle, great Greek philosopher, says, we should be seeking to be virtuous people. We become virtuous through moderation. How does that work? Well, by avoiding behavior that is excessive or deficient. Fraud, we would agree, is intentional. It might be viewed by most rational people as excessive or deficient. So imagine Enron's president, Jeffrey Skilling, who got a chance to go to jail. He even drove to prison in his BMW. Chief Financial Officer for Enron, Arthur Fastow, he got to go to jail for 7 years. Even his wife went to jail. And then, of course, my all-time favorite, WorldCom CEO Bernie Ebbers, who received a 25-year sentence. Here you got the CEO, and you don't get to be the CEO of WorldCom by being an idiot or stupid. Yet, Bernie was a criminal. He just couldn't tell right from wrong, and Aristotle's doctrine, he would be clueless trying to apply. The ends versus means ethic is that worthwhile ends justify the means that would otherwise be considered compromising. Machiavelli is known for this one. Do the ends sought justify the ethical compromising, which you're prepared to defend? So let's go back to my food pantry example. Hey, the food pantry needs food. We got starving people in Vermilion. We got 24% of our population beneath the poverty line. The food pantry needs food. So the huckster goes and shoplifts food at Walmart and Hy-Vee. Do the ends sought justify the means? We have the golden rule that all of you are already familiar with, which actually, as you read in John Maxwell's Ethics 101 book, says is really universal. that virtually every culture has a form of the golden rule, as well as different religions. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So, how do you feel about other people making up the numbers for quarterly earnings reports? I bet if you got a 401k or a stock portfolio of any type, I bet you would be very much opposed to that. You do not want to be treated that way. The intuition ethic says that we intuitively know right from wrong, sometimes referred to as the conscience or the little black box that talks to us and says, "Oh, huckster, what you're proposing to do, I think you know, huckster, is wrong, wrong, wrong. Stealing for the food pantry, nah, that just is not a good thing to do because it's wrong, wrong, wrong. Two wrongs do not, two wrongs can't justify or create a right. And so that proposal is unethical and wrong, wrong, wrong. There's always the might equals right ethic rationalization that what a person has the strength and power to accomplish is sometimes considered right. Well, this would certainly gut or eviscerate any claim of legitimacy or justice in business conduct, wouldn't it? Oh, here's one of my favorites. Being loyal to the organization ethic. Now, it's true. And Wells Fargo, I think, is a current and ongoing saga illustration that, yeah, being loyal to the organization doesn't mean you walk off the plank. If the organization asks you to do something that is illegal or unethical, wow, is that what loyalty requires? It may seem that it requires that, but is it right? Is it ethical? And so I think it's true. Organizations are composed of people. And so it is these people that are asking you to compromise your ethics and perhaps even engage in unlawful activity. Oh, no. How about the Herbert Spencer principle of equal freedom? Is that each person may exercise liberties until the point where they infringe on the liberties of others. So back to my assistant controller example. Clearly, the assistant controller providing false quarterly earnings is going to impact other people, right? And other people's liberties. The proportionality ethic applies to situations in which a decision leads to both in good and evil effects. So we have to recognize in conflicted situations that decisions have consequences, sometimes scars. And so it's difficult to rationalize that fraudulent financial reporting will have a good end. So the challenge becomes how to decide ethical dilemmas correctly. Well, there are 5 steps our author suggests a decision maker ought to consider. So let's go back to my assistant controller example. The type of good and evil involved. Producing a false quarterly earnings report. That's obviously, since it's a publicly traded company, going to be going to the Securities and Exchange Commission and other government and state agencies. Good, evil. Good, evil. Which is the type of good and evil involved? What is the urgency of the situation? Got a quarterly earnings report. Got to have a report, right? The probability of both good and evil effects, sometimes referred to as a cost-benefit analysis. The intensity of influence over effects. The intensity. This is where the conflict comes in between personal needs and organizational goals. And then, of course, the existence of alternatives. Sometimes, that's why I mentioned earlier, speaking truth to power is always an alternative that is confronting power. Sir, do I understand that you're asking me to knowingly, willingly, voluntarily, intelligently author a false quarterly earnings report that will create both criminal fraud and civil fraud? Is that what you are asking me to do? I think that, and I've had those situations before of confronting power with a truthful, statement. And my experience has been they always, as a rule, back down. Nobody in their right mind is going to say, that's exactly what I'm asking you to do. We're all criminals here at this company. You're just, a new one. No, I would suggest that's not the way business really works. There's the principle of double effect. That is a form of proportionality. Actions are deemed ethical if three conditions exist. The good effects of a decision outweigh the evil. Sort of hard to see that with my Enron example or my assistant controller example or the other ones that we've mentioned. The manager's intention is to achieve the good effects. All good managers should be looking to achieve that. And then, of course, there's no better alternative. Is that true? There's no better alternative. We've got the rights ethic, protects important liberties that people have, an important consideration. The theory of justice, that, we should be acting for the common good of all in our society. We got John Rawls, who suggests, hey, a set of principles of justice should be chosen by rational persons. There's the distributive justice ethical model, the retributive justice model, because clearly our justice system does work. It works very well, as Bernie Ebbers would probably testify to. And so cause and effect relationship. Compensatory justice. Hey, harmed victims can ultimately, and that's what happened actually in the interesting Enron case. The Enron, remember, in business, all employees owe their business and employers a fiduciary responsibility. And what does the F word, fiduciary, stand for? The legal duty of utmost trust that all employees owe their employers and their companies. Now, even the CEOs are under a fiduciary duty. So when Enron executives put what was called a blackout on all Enron employees from selling their Enron stock in their 401k plan, but the blackout period order didn't apply to the 200 Enron executives who promptly sold $640 million worth of Enron stock in their 401k plans. So you got two different types of behavior, one for the executives, another for the employees. The employees turned around and sued the executives for breach of their fiduciary duty. So, and certainly Bernie Ebbers got stripped of every dime he ever thought of having, sued by shareholders who lost money on the collapse and bankruptcy of WorldCom. Cause and effect relationships. And then, of course, there's and you've all heard of the utilitarian ethic that says, look, the ethical decision that produces the greatest good for the greatest number should be the course of action followed. The greatest good for the greatest number. So back to my food pantry example. Well, stealing food from a store to give it to the food pantry. Well, is that the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, certainly the food is going to help a number of people, but how many people am I hurting by stealing food from a grocer? Well, we certainly would say it's going to have an effect on the shareholders, right? Certainly going to have an effect on the managers, right? May very well have an effect on the brand of the organization, and certainly can have an effect on the employees when they're asked, so why are we having all of this food stolen? What's the problem here? And so where's the greatest good here? Is it really feeding the few people that your theft offers? Now, another Greek philosopher says, look, we should be looking at the virtue ethic as a source of ethical behavior. What is the excuse me. What does that simply mean? Well, it says that we need to practice 4 cardinal virtues. Justice, we all know what justice is, right? Not just ice, it means justice. Temperance, practicing temperance. Certainly courage and wisdom. So these are certainly virtues that you would be practicing by speaking truth to power, wouldn't you? So, does fraudulent reporting serve any of these virtues, do you think? Hopefully not. Hopefully not. There is research to confirm that ethical decisions have a neural basis. That is, that there's an automatic process of neural circuits that cause ethical judgments to appear in our thinking. And so, yes, emotional circuits and rational circuits are activated by ethical decisions. Now, correct decision making produces positive effects, and of course, negative effects are produced by unethical decisions. Now, are there exceptions to every rule? Yes. Once in a rare while, you run across someone who I simply refer to as a criminal, one who cannot tell the difference between right or wrong, nor do they care to. But the good news is those folks are rare, statistically. So there is a lot of neuroscience that says, look, most of us, if you make bad ethical decisions, aren't going to feel very good about it. In fact, are probably going to physiologically feel bad about it, and it can even affect your health. And I've seen that happen in business when people have made wrong decisions and they've suffered physiologically, for it. Whereas people who choose the harder right over the easier wrong, at the end of the day, even though there may be some personal cost involved, they feel physiologically better about it. Why? Because I think of the neural connections. So, how about some ideas of how, besides using the ethical principles we've talked about, what are some ideas to help us deconflict situations where our personal needs are wrapped up in conflict with organizational goals? I think these suggestions by the author make practical sense. Learning to pay attention to the ethical intuition that you possess, that is, listen to your conscience. What is it telling you to do? Consider using simple decision methods such as devil's advocacy. You all heard of, well, let me play the devil's advocate. That is, take an opposite position and talk it through. Certainly using a cost-benefit analysis is helpful. Sorting out your ethical priorities before dilemmas arise. You should know that once you are asked to engage in an unethical and maybe even illegal decision, you're probably going to get asked again and again and again. So confronting your ethical priorities at the beginning is crucial. Role model examples. And I think managers are certainly role models. And nothing moves quicker in a company than the informal network. And so when unethical decision making takes place, then this spreads fairly quickly. Having the courage to translate principles into action, easier said than done, but certainly cultivating sympathy and charity towards others, I think, is humanistic. So I may have told you the story about the Land's End case involving a marketing vice president who was really the number one money maker for Land's End. And the CEO was a large stockholder in Land's End, and Land's End had a HR policy that employees were not permitted to engage in dating or social relationships with managers, because obviously they didn't want to see managers taking advantage of employees, sexual harassment, right? So this cleaning lady, this one night, was cleaning, going into the office of the marketing vice president, only to discover him in fellatio with his secretary on a couch in his office. Well, while the custodian excused herself abruptly, the word spread through the company as to what she had observed. And it obviously created a cause célèbre in the informal network of Land's End. And so eventually the CEO was confronted with what everybody else already knew, that we had a violation of the company policy, but wow, this is the most valuable employee he's got. This will cost him a lot to enforce the policy and fire the employee. So this went on for a number of weeks, and then finally the CEO called a all hands on deck meeting in the atrium of Land's End headquarters. And of course, everybody is waiting to see, so what's he gonna say? He's the role model, right? So it reminds me of the old phrase from Animal Farm. All pigs are created equal. It just so happens that some pigs are more equal than others. And so that was the question presented here. Is this marketing vice president hotshot going to get special treatment because of, his economic impact on the company? So after calling everybody together, and there's this long, prolonged silence, after getting everybody's undivided attention, the CEO announces he has terminated the employment of said marketing vice president for the reasons everybody in the company already knows. And that when there's a company policy regarding behavior, he expects it to be adhered to. And that's the end of the story. And there was a quick termination, but there was a role model example from the top on down. Guess what? No more social fraternization at Land's End since that time. And so had that happened at Wells Fargo, I think they would have headed off a lot of the problems they're currently grappling with. Sorting out ethical priorities before dilemmas arise. If you witness and see in the company that employees are being asked to engage in unethical behavior, as occurred at Wells Fargo, sooner or later, it's going to come around to you, and you're going to get asked to do it. We've already talked about the importance of role modeling, and then, of course, having the personal courage to translate principles into action, and cultivating sympathy and charity for others. So we had several examples in the chapter. Interesting problems, right? Where you've got a vice chairman, very senior level in a company, who falsely claimed an MBA from the University of Michigan, and the CEO finds that out. What should be done? under the circumstances? Well, walking your way through asking these questions are important. So clearly, claiming falsely a degree that one had not earned involves some premeditation, an aggressive, manipulative lie, right? So is that a problem in a senior ranking executive? Past performance certainly has been excellent, and that's a factor, a mitigating factor, if you will. So how should this be weighed? Well, when evaluating this situation in a retributive justice situation, the punishment should be proportional to the crime. I bet most rational people would say, look, when we have crimes occur, when we have unethical conduct occur, the punishment should fit the crime, that we shouldn't be excessive in either situation. So what's the company's policy about statements on resumes? Ooh, role model situation here, right? You're going to have to walk the talk if you've got a HR policy or some other official policy that employees will be terminated for material false statements in their personnel files and reports. That may, take the matter out of your hands because, again, like the Land's End case, hey, are you going to walk your own talk? And, again, different treatment. Are lower level employees being treated differently than the senior employees? Well, we saw that in Wells Fargo, which I think is part of their problem. You got 5,300 employees that were terminated, i.e. fired. But John Stumpf, the CEO, he got retired. He got to keep all these $1 million pension and stock portfolios that he had put together. So he got treated differently by Wells Fargo, and I think Wells is suffering as a consequence of that because everybody knows, hey, their leaders don't walk the talk. How about the case of the Admiral and the thieves? I thought this was an interesting case, having been in the military myself. And we call this, and you've all had psychology, positive versus negative reinforcement. And there certainly is a role for negative reinforcement. But of course, the question, I think, circles around to, does the punishment fit the crime? Now, granted, certainly stealing is serious business. And you certainly have a character flaw in someone who steals. Now, whether they steal $5 or $5,000, stealing is stealing. And I think that's where the Admiral looked at it, saying, look, while the amount of theft is not significant, the point is his command was suffering serious theft, and he needed to make an example of someone. And so these three who were caught suffered a very severe penalty, but in order for everybody else to get religion, a few had to be sacrificed. And that's a hard thing to do. The Admiral was certainly trying to achieve a community good that was to terminate once and for all what had become an endemic and systemic theft problem in his command. Was he successful? I bet he was. So do the means, are the means, justified by the end sought? Are there other options under the circumstances? And I think this is where you can get, creative. That for $25 of theft, does firing these people and the loss of their 30-year pensions, is that reasonable and fair and just under the circumstances? Are there other penalties that can still make the point without, having to be that damaging? And so these are all some of the options. One of my favorite punishments is shame punishment. Uh, I love to see drunk drivers having to walk up and down Main Street for 30 days carrying a sign that says, "I am a drunk driver." Wow! Doesn't cost the person any money, but boy, the shame punishment does impact human behavior. So is there some other way, the admiral could have gotten his point across short of firing? I think getting creative would be called for here. And so we've had these other examples, the Sam, Sally, and Hector, example. The personality tests are very common for companies to try and identify personality traits that may be conducive or not conducive with a particular employment, setting. Not unusual. The military requires all personnel, potential officers enlisted, all to take tests before they're brought into the military. How about this? Lying or the intentional misstatement of facts is not ethical. It violates principles such as the categorical imperative. I'm not so sure I agree with that. I think, puffery is acceptable that is trying to, as we like to say sometimes, put lipstick on a pig, trying to make a bad situation look good. I think outright lying or an intentional misstatement of fact, I think, is not ethical. And so, again, we call it sales talk sometimes, but it's known in the field as puffery, where you're trying to put lipstick on the pig. Okay? Is that actual deceit? Maybe there's a fine line between marketing and deceit, but I think you have to be discerning in that analysis. How about the Al case, the sales rep? Violating company policy in order to get ahead. And again, I think puts his superiors in a difficult position as a valuable employee like we had at Wells Fargo. But other people are seeing him behave in a way that violates company policy. So what's the cause and effect relationship? How about the trip to SeaWorld? I think the answer in this case is simply this is the type of business question you raise to your superiors, and let your superiors make a decision about whether or not the company is going to provide the requested trip and whatnot. Again, disclosure. I think will resolve the situation. Mary and Tom, how about that? Competition. What's the ethical thing to do under the circumstances? The Honda auction, actually, that was fraud, unlawful activity. It certainly violated the categorical imperative, but it was unlawful too. Certainly violates the golden rule too. The Tokyo Bay Steamship Company, how about that? Interesting case. Making money from a situation that involves a cause célèbre of people committing suicide and all. So I think these are good questions that you should work through to see ethically how you think the answers should turn out. Tiger Woods, all familiar with his case, right? Nike did unload him at the time from their board of directors. Tangled webs, oh baby. man and a woman who meet through these crazy websites. Oh, baby, certainly involves some serious ethical issues. Well, these are the things that I wanted to bring to your attention. Work your way through these ethical problems. I'm not going to beat them to death, but I think they're good illustrations of problems that happen in the business world that require ethical decision making. So I wish you the best of thinking and hope that this conversation has been worth your time, because correct decision making, while hard and challenging, is at the end of the day where you want to be. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope all is well at your end. As always, I invite you to send me emails regarding any issues or questions involving our course that you need assistance on. I'm here for you. Let's hear from you. Stay well. Bye-bye.